Now we're going to do Ignite talks. We have 3 Ignite speakers. The way the Ignites work is they've given us 20 slides. They are going to auto proceed every 15 seconds. There's going to be another slide. They're auto advance. That's the right word. So yeah, first we have Charlotte Waterhouse. She's going to talk about why she quit her dev job.
I quit my dev job. My name is Charlotte Waterhouse, and I'm going to talk about why a project at a financial services company inspired me to quit my job and what I'm doing now in Detroit. A little bit more about me. I was a math major, and I graduated in 2016. I'm a millennial, and I am now a full-time volunteer with Mercy Volunteer Corps here in Detroit. I found a love for programming in college, later in college, and then was fortunate to get a job as a developer out of college. And I worked as a programmer for a few years, and I really love coding and programming and DevOps. Yeah, but there was one project that I worked on that projects your monthly monthly income at retirement, and it was a great project. But when I logged into prod and saw my own retirement income, it made me realize that I am going to retire one day. I will get old, and I will turn 65 in 2059 and likely retire around the year 2060, and the world is going to look different then. It's going to look very different then, and so is DevOps. But Greta Thunberg, environmental activist, has said, I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic and act as if the house is on fire. Climate change is real, folks, and by 2050, we could see a rise in global temperature by 5.3 degrees Fahrenheit, or 3 degrees Celsius. And this rise in temperature will have an impact on life by 2050, when I retire. We can see a loss of the Amazon rainforest, 1/2 to 1/3 of the Amazon rainforest will be gone. Rising sea temperatures will cause violent hurricanes and typhoons, and an increased air pollution and more lethal bacteria and fungi will have interesting health effects. And climate change is going to impact some people more than others. It will especially impact those living in poverty, and it will cause people to leave their homes. There will be an estimated 200 million climate migrants by the year 2050. So what is my retirement going to look like in 2060? What am I saving for, and what am I helping other people saving for with my code? I came up with 3 cases. Case 1. The simple case, I am dead by 65. I was killed by some super bacteria or weather-related incident, or there's another freeze, and I'm just very cold, and I spontaneously combust. Case 2, I'm alive, but cost of living is going to go up, and I didn't save enough, and I still have to work, and just my quality of life is very low. Not an ideal retirement. And case 3, by saving effectively for retirement, I could be lucky and privileged enough to shield my family and myself from the effects of climate change. But, however, I do suspect that climate change is going to have an impact on all of us. Whether you like it or not, you might have to move from your home, or you might not be able to eat your favorite foods like avocados. Who knows what that will look like. There's a saying, only the pigs talk. It's an agile saying that only the dev scrum team should be talking because they're 100% committed. The chicken lays the eggs, but the pigs are the bacon. And with that, I decided I have to be 100% committed to my future. I have to do something, and I can't just not worry about climate change, because it's going to impact us regardless. So that's why I'm here in Detroit, is because Detroit has a lot of good initiatives. They have a lot of good nonprofits and a lot of good things going for them right now. The Financial Empowerment Center is for low-income residents and lower middle-income residents, and it helps them with financial planning. And then I'm working at Community and Home Supports, and they serve people suffering from homelessness in Detroit by helping them find sustainable housing. And I think climate change is going to worsen the wealth inequality gap, and there are things that we have to do in order to mitigate those effects on all of us in our retirements. So we have more work to do, and eventually I will get back to work. But right now, I'm retiring. And I did have one more slide after this one, but it just said my sources, because I didn't make all this up. And also, if you wanted to learn more about Mercy Volunteer Corps or support me, you can go to mercyvolunteer.org/Charlotte Waterhouse. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Sorry about that. Next, we have Dave Karow and about how he taught his 6-year-old daughter to code and deploy.
Okay, if you guys would get out your phones, don't use them yet, but have your phone handy for the end of my talk. So, show of hands, how many people here have a daughter or a niece or a neighbor who's a girl under the age of 10? Well, lots of you, great. My daughter is 7, she was 6 when I came up with the idea for this talk. I've worked with and for a lot of amazing women in tech throughout my career, but I don't think there's enough of them. I think that creating a more diverse workforce requires a different sort of pipeline. A pipeline that makes coding tangible so that we can instill a sense of tech curiosity and to give girls a chance to feel a sense of mastery over code at an early age. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. How many of you remember the dawn of the personal computer era in the 80s? Those of you that are under 30 weren't even alive yet, right? So let's just take a minute and look back to the past before we figure out how to get into the future. I want to give credit where credit is due. I wouldn't have the idea for this talk if it weren't for Angie Jones. She's a prolific dev advocate, and I follow her on Twitter. Angie came up with an idea for a talk, and it was a talk about teaching girls to code, and it was called Coding Future Coders. And if you look closely at this, Angie loves to code so much that she made her title slide and her agenda slides and her transition slides code in an editor. Flora and Pop had asked on Twitter how old people were when they wrote their first line of code, and Angie assembled some of the answers. And you'll see for the guys here, they were typically between 7 and 10, but the women tended to be 20s or older. Angie asked, what's up with the ladies? Why was it that the women weren't learning to code until they were in college or later in their careers, but the men had learned to code when they were, well, young kids? She decided to take a look back at the 80s and see if she could find some answers. She presented a bunch of TV ads and magazine ads, and do you see any patterns here? They're pretty much all men and boys, except there's one picture with a girl in the middle, but she's a sister admiring what her brother is doing. What the heck? Right? Like, some people would say, oh, the advertising companies were just catering to demand and that only the men and the boys were interested in computers, right? But advertising exists to create demand, right? So Dorothy Vaughan, Grace Hopper, they were early pioneers in programming. And women's interest in computer science was strong and growing right up to the mid-'80s, where it cratered and went down, even as interest in other tech careers continued to rise. Angie didn't waste any time on assigning blame. Instead, she chose to find ways to help young girls experience the same joy she found in coding. I decided to take some of my interests and do something similar, starting with my own kitchen table. By day, I'm an evangelist for Split's feature delivery platform, helping companies move faster but more safely using feature flags to manage, monitor, and experiment with gradual feature rollouts. At night, I like to hang out on the weekends too with my family and build stuff. And one day, I was looking on Amazon and I saw this kit. For $65, you got a tiny computer called a BBC Microbit. You heard about that earlier. This thing comes with dozens of pre-integrated parts and a dock that's full of short projects that take 5 or 10 minutes each. And it dawned on me that we could take DevOps principles, combine it with that kit, so things like small batch sizes, limiting work in progress, fast cycle time, in order to create an environment that kids 6 or 7 years old would actually have fun playing with. So we got out an old Windows laptop, we printed out the docs, we started dropping in blocks of code and assigning variables to the pin numbers that we were wiring to, and making deployments to the microbit, and when things didn't go well, we'd make changes and redeploy. And before we took our first break, we had done 3 projects, and then she wanted to do the accelerometer and the servo project, where she could see her inputs instantly transformed into outputs, and she even pushed this little ball across the table. She was having a blast. I was pretty stoked hearing her repeatedly let out shrieks of joy. She'd become curious about how this all fit together, and she'd had that chance to experience mastery as she learned that she could code, deploy, test, and iterate until the software and the hardware did what she wanted it to. If you like this idea and you want to kind of clone it for yourself, you can snap this QR code. It links to a blog post with a link to the $65 kit, the docs, and editors. I'll leave the QR code up on the screen for one more slide so you have another chance if you're a little slow on the draw. Who knew that DevOps principles would make it easier to teach kids and introduce them to technology? Please take this idea, adapt it, or support one of the many organizations, as one we heard about earlier today, who are making a difference in the world for kids. We don't actually have to repeat the history. We can play a role in shaping it. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. And the last one is Andy Van Slars with Simple.
Hello. Keep it stupid simple. The KISS principle has been attributed to Kelly Johnson, who had a long, successful engineering career at Lockheed, including some time as the VP of Advanced Development Projects, aka Skunkworks. So Johnson hands a team of engineers a handful of basic tools, and he challenges them to make sure the jet they're designing was simple enough to be fixed by an average mechanic with that limited tool set under the stress of combat conditions. So most of us don't need to fix our work or maintain our systems under combat conditions. That doesn't make breaks and problems any less stressful. But the takeaway here is that systems tend to be easier to maintain and more reliable when we keep them simple. Complex systems have dark, scary corners where we can't be sure that touching one thing won't break other things in weird and unexpected ways. So we often leave things the way they are and repeat problematic patterns to avoid the scary places. Even though we're aware of the dangers of complexity, it's pervasive. I'm sure everyone here has had to fix or maintain a complex, over-engineered system. In fact, most of us are probably maintaining one or several right now. I'll go a step further and say most of us at some point in our careers have been the over-engineer, leading the charge on adding complexity where it doesn't belong. So how do we end up here? What is it that brings complexity into our apps? I think it comes from a few sources. First, simple is hard. It's typically easier to create something that's complex than it is to make something simple. Think about those engineers at Lockheed. It would have been far easier for them to not consider field maintenance. Johnson challenged those engineers knowing it wouldn't be easy, but would ultimately lead to the best results, because he understood the value of simplicity. Taking the easy way out can create or compound complexity. Often the path of least resistance is taking something that already exists and duplicating it. And reuse is great, except for when it isn't. Complexity often spreads when we copy things from one place to another. Second, once we've been indoctrinated or we grow comfortable with complexity of our own making, we no longer recognize it. Or worse, we find comfort in it and make excuses for it because it's familiar. And it's not always about being lazy or comfortable. We're naturally curious and we like to do clever things. We want to feel challenged. We like to feel smart. We want to impress our coworkers. So our egos get in the way and complexity rears its ugly head. We also like to solve for the future. When we should be focusing on the problem at hand, we're attempting to be clairvoyant, trying to predict future problems and needlessly complicating things in the process. So we know that simple is more desirable than complex. We've identified some of the reasons we end up introducing and perpetuating complexity. So how do we stem the tide of complexity and keep things simple? First, we need to be vigilant. We should regularly be asking questions like, have you considered a simpler approach? Are we letting things get too complicated? Do we really want to repeat this pattern? And can this be simplified further? Stop trying to predict the future. We're bad at it. You can consider extensibility and be forward thinking without trying to accurately predict every single thing the future holds. And of course, none of this is easy, so you need to invest in simplicity up front. A simple system will be easier to understand and change in the future. This requires effort, and it's easier to put that effort in at the beginning. Simplicity is hard, but it's even harder to retrofit. And also, recognize that complexity happens. It can't be avoided entirely. So we need to do our best to contain it, push it to the edges. Abstract the complexity away where you can. Just beware of premature and hasty abstractions. Complexity will spread like a weed without intervention. When you come across existing complexity or see it trying to creep into your work, you need to intervene. And don't assume anybody else will. And keep this in mind, complexity is kind of like glitter. It doesn't take much for it to get everywhere, but it's incredibly difficult to get rid of once it's there. So next time you see complexity creeping in, think about that birthday card covered in glitter, recognize that the glitter will stick to you, and consider a different design. So be like the Skunkworks team, embrace constraints, put the work in up front, and strive for simplicity. Thank you.